In the census of 1861, there appears a name that did not raise alarm at the time, though it should have. Ashton Isaac, Reverend, 10 dependents, agricultural. The ink is neat, the handwriting is precise, but no one remembers knocking on his door. Tax officials swore they never made it past the eastern bramble line where the trees grew in tight, sickly rings and the ground refused to hold moisture. That land beyond Manchester County had long been dismissed as unsuitable for crops, yet the records showed yields. Bushels, wool, cured meats. Enough to suggest a working homestead. Enough to suggest life. But not once in 30 years did a field hand or tradesman report stepping foot on the Ashton property. It was not on any county map. The road stopped short of it, though one logging path, overgrown and unused, curled toward the coordinates listed in land archives. When surveyors returned in 1891 to update parcel boundaries, they followed that route. What they found was not a house. It was a structure sunken with rot, overtaken by vines that hadn't been cut back in decades. The front gate still hung, hand-carved with initials. IA, and below that, 10 small X's. Staggered, evenly spaced, almost like stitches. The house itself stood on limestone blocks, but parts of the foundation had collapsed inward. There were no signs of children, no toys, no linens, no small shoes. But there were 10 narrow beds in a single upstairs room, each perfectly made with straw-filled ticking, and each with a small iron hook mounted above the pillow, empty but worn. Along the hallway, a narrow shelf held 10 black books, ledgers, each with a single name etched into the spine in a child's uneven scrawl. The names matched none in the county records. No births, no baptisms, just names. Leah, Benjamin, Thomas, Ruth, Micah, Eliza, Caleb, Miriam, Samuel, Lydia. All followed by the same last name, Ashton. A family that by documentation should have been known, but no neighbors recalled children playing. No schools registered them. No one ever recalled seeing even one. Isaac Ashton had once been a physician trained in Boston, fluent in Latin and theological Greek, known for his soft demeanor and passionate sermons about correction through self-denial. He had vanished from public life in 1852 after a series of church scandals involving extreme measures of discipline, though nothing was ever proven. One report mentioned his belief in physical reprioritization, a doctrine that claimed the soul could be lifted above sin by rendering the body entirely subject to moral command. Years later, locals whispered that Ashton had founded a spiritual retreat deep in the woods for reformation of the unwanted. The unwanted in those days meant the orphaned, the slow, the unbaptized, or simply the unclaimed. Children whose silence could be guaranteed. On the property, a detached structure still stood, a whitewashed cabin without windows, its door bolted shut from the outside with iron latches. Inside, a single wooden chair faced a blank wall, and on that wall hundreds of tally marks had been carved, some so deep they splintered the grain. 10 rows of them, none exceeded the number 20. In the attic, beneath crumbling beams, investigators found a bundle of letters, all addressed to someone named Brother R. The envelopes were never posted. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the contents were intact. Isaac wrote of progress, of soul silencing, and of preparation for return. He described the children as fractured vessels, and insisted he had been sent to reshape them, to thread the flesh into instruments of reverence. He mentioned failures, though he never used that word. Instead, he called them incompletes. He listed the dates of their quieting. All 10 fell within the same week in 1887. The final letter ended abruptly. There was no signature, just a final sentence scrawled in a shaking hand. The echoes will end when the last breath matches the first silence. When the county deemed the property condemned and sent workers to demolish what remained, they reported something odd. Tools broke at the base of the house. Soil refused to give. Beneath the structure, embedded in the foundation, were 10 small compartments, each lined with linen, each empty except for a single wax-sealed jar. Inside every jar, a lock of hair, a strip of leather marked with initials, and a tooth. When asked to confirm the identity of the family who had lived there, state officials could only repeat what was in the book. Ashton, Isaac, 10 dependents, agricultural, but no birth certificates, no graves, no records of adoption, just names, scratched into walls, stitched into rope, and written into soil. The house is gone now, but the ground, they say, still resists planting, like it remembers, and refuses to let anything grow. She was found at the edge of dawn, barefoot and shivering, just beyond the ash line where the trees ended and the burned clearing began. Her skin was brittle with age, hair matted into ropes of gray, nails chipped and curled like bark. She wore a black cotton shift, decades out of fashion, and carried no belongings but one, a single ivory button clenched in her left hand, smeared faintly with dried blood and etched crudely with the name Benjamin. When she was taken into care, she gave no name. She could not. Her tongue had been mutilated, not cut clean, but split down the middle and stitched back in place with horsehair thread, healed badly. Scar tissue thick. She made no sound, only hummed low through her nose, a sound so faint and repetitive that it unsettled the nurses more than silence. Authorities identified her as Eunice Catherwood only through a discarded birth certificate found in the pocket seam of her dress. That name had last appeared in state orphan ledgers in 1841. A girl surrendered to the Church of Penitent Mercy at age 4. Records ended there. No mention of foster placement, no death notice. Just a blank where a life should have followed. But what truly confused investigators was the second surname stitched into the inside hem of her dress. Ashton. Same black thread, same hand-sewn script. Eunice had never married, never had family of her own. So why carry that name? And why wander from the center of the long-forgotten Ashton clearing, a site long marked as condemned after the farmhouse fire in 1891? No one had revisited that place in years. Grass refused to regrow. The house had long since collapsed into a sunken heap of stone and char, but her tracks had emerged from there. Bare feet straight from the hearth, as if she had come out of the very soil. Her hands were raw and flecked with soot. Beneath her fingernails, wax residue, fibers from candle wicks, and flakes of black paint. When the ivory button was examined, it showed signs of long-term handling, grooved from years of being rubbed, nearly smoothed on one side. Under magnification, the name Benjamin appeared carved not once, but over and over. Dozens of overlapping engravings, like someone had rewritten it until they couldn't forget. But no one could locate any Benjamin Ashton in birth registries. No grave, no census, just the name, same as one of the ledgers found in the farmhouse's attic 2 decades earlier. That ledger, too, had no dates, only a column labeled corrections, filled with small symbols resembling punishment notations or rituals. The connection, while disturbing, couldn't be proven. But the woman, Eunice, carried that name inside her. She had lived somewhere all these years. At the care facility, she remained awake most nights, staring out the barred window toward nothing. On the first Friday of each month, she tore her pillow open and scattered the stuffing into a line across the floor. No one knew why. Once a nurse walked in early and saw her on her knees, blowing gently across the feathers, whispering through the part in her tongue. The nurse swore the only word she made out was count. After that, Eunice stopped using pillows entirely. She died 6 weeks after being found from what coroners called acute systemic shutdown. No trauma, no illness, just a slow failure of organs like a machine turned off from the inside. When they prepared her body, staff found more buttons hidden in the lining of her dress. 9 more, each ivory, each scratched with a name. All names from the ledgers, all children no one remembered seeing. There were 10 in total. She had carried them like talismans, like proof, or perhaps like guilt. The trees surrounding the Ashton property had grown in too close, as if drawn by something beneath the surface. Their roots buckled stone and split fences, but they did not enter the garden. That space, 4 perfect squares forming a cross, remained untouched, unnaturally preserved. Grass had withered there decades ago, yet no weeds grew. The soil held no scent of rot, no worms, no birdsong above. Investigators who arrived in spring expected to find overgrowth, maybe remnants of forgotten vegetables. Instead, they found beds of earth so compacted they cracked like old parchment under the shovel. The first trowel came up full of ash, the second fragments of bone, and the third, a child's jaw, milk teeth still intact, curled in a grimace too small to belong to anyone older than 9. Each garden plot had its own wooden sign, nailed into the earth like a grave marker. The names were simple: obedience, modesty, silence, and cleanliness. The script was careful, deliberate, carved with precision. One investigator remarked it looked less like labeling and more like commandments. They assumed at first the bones had been dumped there, but soil analysis showed otherwise. The remains were layered, evenly spaced through sediment, years of burials compressed over time. Like compost, the forensics expert said, but not one that had ever grown food. No stalks, no seeds, not even remnants of root systems. Only bones, and in many cases bones that bore surgical markings, polished indentations, shallow bores, signs of deliberate removal. Fingers missing tips, ribs shaved down, jawbones too clean. Among the fragments, cloth scraps appeared, some black wool, linen, cotton dyed in faded gray. Hand-stitched, child-sized. Several had names sewn into the inside seams. All 10 matched the ledgers. Beneath the garden labeled silence, the bones were markedly smaller, skulls underdeveloped, larynxes absent, not damaged. Surgically extracted and scattered among the vertebrae, waxed strings, some still looped into loose nooses. They weren't tools. They were symbols, tokens, as if each child had been claimed and buried with the method of their quieting. Beneath obedience, femurs were fractured but healed, crooked from time, proof of sustained restraint. Shackles, perhaps, or methods even more precise. One pelvis was found turned upside down and split at the seam. Not from trauma, but ritualistic disassembly. Each injury told a story. Each story was the same lesson. One plot contained no bones at all, only a single object, a cracked glass jar, half filled with yellowed parchment slips. Scripture verses, each carefully written in a child's hand, most incomplete. One verse was written over and over again, almost compulsively. Spare the rod, spoil the child. The same verse found etched onto a cellar beam inside the collapsed house. By the end of the first week, the team stopped digging. Not out of regulation, but from something older. Something that made the hands hesitate and the chest tighten. It wasn't grief, it wasn't fear, it was shame. As if they had stepped into a place where the ground itself had learned silence. A garden built not to feed the body, but to shape the soul by force. The bones did not scream, but they remembered. And the soil, it held their names without needing words. They found the lockbox buried 2 feet beneath a rotted floor beam in what once had been the parlor. A place where family would have gathered, where warmth might have lived. But there were no chairs, no hearth, no remnants of domestic life. Just splintered planks and a trap of rusted nails that gave under a boot. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with a red ribbon, were 31 letters, each addressed simply, to Brother R. There were no return addresses, no dates visible from the outside, just a wax seal marked with a faint symbol. An open eye carved into the center of a cross. The letters were sorted by hand, numbered faintly in pencil, and each folded with care. The paper smelled of mold and blood. The ink had faded in places, but not enough to obscure the message. In them, Isaac Ashton does not write like a father or a reverend. He writes like a scientist conducting trials on specimens he believes are not yet whole. He never refers to the children as sons or daughters, only as units, subjects, or forms in progress. He speaks of soul inversion, a theory he attributes to early monastic texts. The belief that to cleanse sin one must reorder the vessel. He believed sin entered through the senses, so he sought to nullify entry points. In one letter, he describes sewing the eyelids of a particularly resistant form shut for 3 weeks, then noting with satisfaction that, upon reopening, the eyes did not seek light. Another details a regimen called the saturation fast, in which the child is fed only water steeped with ashes of their own belongings, buttons, hair, notes. He claimed this dissolved the ego. More chilling was his explanation of what he termed purity compression, a method by which a child's limbs were bound tightly in soaked muslin, wound tighter each day until all voluntary movement ceased. He claimed the subject entered a sacred stillness, no longer ruled by impulse. In margins, he sketched anatomical drawings, crude, sometimes upside down, where he annotated points of pressure with notations like submission achieved or rebellion remains in marrow. One subject, M, is described as responding with involuntary crying during night hours. Ashton notes, crying is residual selfhood, must correct through isolation. Later entries show the same subject listed as quieted with a Latin phrase beside it, gladius veritatis, the sword of truth. As the letters progress, the tone changes. Ashton becomes more defensive, as if Brother R had questioned his methods. He insists the children are not being harmed, only moved closer to divine order. He calls pain a symptom of unraveling false identity. He defends the removal of teeth, explaining that the mouth lies and must therefore be humbled. He lists the hours of each correction, noting the alignment with scripture readings, solstice days, and even lunar phases. In one letter, he speaks of a breakthrough, a child who remained silent for 40 days, responded only with gestures, and moved through space as if no longer owned by flesh. That child, he writes, was named Benjamin. The final letter is more a confession than a report. In it, Ashton describes a vision he claims to have received, a dream of a house with no walls where the children stood in rows, each holding a mirror. But the mirrors showed only him again and again. He ends the letter not with hope, but warning. When the body is conquered, what remains must be claimed quickly, or others will. The letter is unsigned. Below the final sentence, a single drop of dried blood mars the paper, pressed into the word claimed. The records weren't obvious at first. Scattered across county borders, misfiled under different parishes and jurisdictions, the names were written in shaky hands. Their birthplaces vague. Their custody statuses labeled with euphemisms like indenture, probationer, or simply unplaced. But when overlaid chronologically, a pattern emerged. Every 2 to 3 years between 1852 and 1876, 2 children vanished from separate orphanages on the same week, sometimes the same day. Always a boy and a girl, always with matching features. And always under the approval of the same sponsoring cleric, Reverend Isaac Ashton. They were never labeled as siblings, but the physical similarities were undeniable. Same eye color, same shape of chin or curve of nose, even the same unique birthmarks, mirrored on opposite sides of the body. Not true twins by birth, but chosen for symmetry, as if selected from a gallery for how well they matched. At St. Thaddeus Asylum, one matron recalled a man who arrived during a storm in 1863, asking to see the quiet ones. She remembered because he never spoke directly to the children, only to her, and always in numbers. "I'll take the two that reflect," he said once, gesturing toward a pair of 7-year-olds who rarely spoke and shared a pale streak of hair at the crown. She never saw them again. Records show they were rehomed through ecclesiastical process, but no paperwork followed. The children weren't removed by force. They were taken with permission, signed off as spiritual adoptions, often exchanged for church donations or the promise of religious guidance. Ashton's letters, Mays uncovered later, revealed he saw these pairings not as siblings but as living mirrors, conduits through which he could observe the unnatural imperfections of the soul made visible. He believed that when two bodies resembled one another, their divergences, even the subtlest, were signs of internal corruption. One must always break before the other. The stronger would suppress, the weaker would reveal. That contrast to Ashton was divine instruction. In a journal entry found inside a hymnal wedged behind the rafters of the Ashton attic, he wrote, "Duality breeds revelation. One child clings to false self. The other dissolves. One lies. The other becomes silence itself." He detailed experiments where one child was allowed limited freedom, access to bread, sunlight, music, while the other was restricted to punishment, hunger, isolation. Then, after a fixed period, he would switch their roles. According to him, the transitions were not symmetrical. One child always converted. The other resisted and was marked. The names found in the ledgers match this logic. Each ledger contains 2 columns, reflected and revealed, and in the margins cryptic notes in Latin or initials marked with red ink. In one, the words "Benjamin revealed" appear beside the phrase "mutum in aeternum," silent forever. Eunice Catherwood's name appears in a note scrawled beside another pairing. She walks in silence, but sees too much. In the basement beneath the homestead, where damp had rotted most documents, investigators recovered a broken slate. Scratched faintly into its surface were 10 names, the same 10 as the ledgers, arranged in 5 pairs. A line connected each pair, and in every case one name was marked with a star. It was unclear what the symbol meant. Some believed it denoted survival. Others believed it meant completion. None of the children were ever seen again outside that house. No photographs exist, only approximated sketches drawn decades later from the memory of shaken caretakers. What disturbed archivists most wasn't the disappearances. It was the intention behind them. Ashton hadn't merely taken children. He had chosen them like instruments, tuned them for contrast, then listened for the discord. And once it arrived, once one child outlasted the other, he considered the lesson complete. The barn had collapsed in on itself years before investigators arrived. Only the stone footings remained steady, half swallowed by moss and wind-blown leaves. But beneath the rot, under the warped floorboards and rusted nails, lay something disturbingly intact. A cast-iron bell, greened with age, its clapper stiff with congealed matter that later proved to be human blood. Not spilled, but smeared, layer over layer, as though touched or kissed by bleeding mouths across years. The bell was mounted not in a tower, but low, embedded into a wooden frame buried into the earth. Around it were 4 upright beams forming a kind of skeletal scaffold. From them hung ropes, looped through rusted pulleys, their frayed ends dangling at precisely wrist height for a child. The knots at each end were tight, shaped not for hauling weight, but for securing limbs. Hands above the head, elbows bent awkwardly, body suspended just enough to strain but not to break. Carved into one of the beams, deep enough to survive rot, were the words, "The Weighing." No further explanation. But inside a nearby trunk, shielded from decay by oilcloth and packed straw, lay a dozen scraps of paper torn from journals or hymnals. They described the ritual in Isaac Ashton's own hand. The soul must be lifted before it can be seen. The body must confess through weight. If guilt outweighs breath, the bell shall know. It was not a metaphor. Beneath the bell's mount, a hollow pit had been dug, not deep, but lined with chalk markings. One of the sketches found on the property indicated that children were suspended above this pit while the bell hung just overhead. If they struggled or cried, or moved too soon, their bodies would rock the ropes, and the bell would ring, a confession in sound. Ashton wrote, "Only stillness is purity. Stillness means they hear the voice." Witness accounts from nearby towns in the 1860s mention hearing bells at odd hours, long after midnight, carried faintly on the wind. None remembered a church operating in those woods. Some believed it was a distant call to prayer. Others, years later, would remember it as something else entirely, a toll not meant for the living. The ropes showed signs of repeated use, fibers compressed by small wrists, blood at the knots, skin residue embedded in the coarse strands. One rope in particular was shorter than the others, its end knotted with what appeared to be a strip of muslin embroidered with the letter M. The coroner noted bruising patterns on remains found in the Modesty Garden matched those that would result from short-term suspension. Not long enough to kill, but long enough to fracture small capillaries in the arms and leave lasting trauma. Ashton called it pre-baptism. In his letters, he described the purpose: to drain the life from the limbs. The more they fight, the more they declare themselves unworthy. According to one page, the child was not to be removed until they had gone fully still for at least 100 heartbeats. Ashton believed this marked surrender, a sign that the soul had yielded its rebellion. The bell then would remain silent. If it rang, the ritual restarted. In one chilling entry, he notes that some children took to stillness too easily and had to be awakened with lashes before the weighing could begin again. For only resistance reveals the soul's true texture. It was never about punishment, not in the way we understand it. It was about control of breath, control of instinct, the slow erasure of the will. Ashton didn't want obedience through fear. He wanted stillness through defeat. And the bell, that was his measure, not of weight, but of struggle. And in his warped theology, struggle meant guilt. The bell never stopped ringing. The furnace had collapsed in on itself years ago, its iron belly rusted through, bricks scattered like teeth in the ash. But when the forensic team sifted through the char and cinders, they found something that had not burned. A piece of skin, smooth and pale, stiff like parchment, but unmistakably human. It had not shriveled like the others. It had been preserved, flattened beneath a stone slab weighted intentionally atop it. Someone had wanted it kept whole. At first they thought it was a remnant of clothing or stretched hide. But under magnification, the truth emerged. It wasn't ink. It was a message, a confession, written into flesh, not with pen but by a series of cauterized lines, seared with tiny instruments or heated needles. Every letter precise, barely the size of a grain of rice. The script looped in careful arcs, uninterrupted like a prayer unspoken but burned inward. And at the very bottom, curled in small fading marks, was the name Lydia Ashton. one of the 10 children listed in the attic ledgers, the same name marked with a star on the slate. The text was not fragmented. It was a single passage methodically constructed, beginning with the words, "I was born again through silence." What followed was not a journal, nor a cry for help. It was an accounting, a ritual inventory of acts endured and accepted. Lydia detailed what Ashton called the lambing period, a season of quiet where each child was forbidden to speak, eat solid food, or sleep indoors. She wrote of sleeping in the garden soil, of being buried in straw to muffle dreams, of licking condensation from barn walls just to stay alive. One sentence read, "We were told thirst was the mouth's regret, and that water was only for those who forgot how to ask." More disturbing still were the descriptions of the marking hours. Lydia wrote of being taken one at a time into the furnace room, not for punishment, but for what Ashton called illumination. Each child was given a task: to recite their own sins while he carved them in symbolic form onto the back, the thighs, the soft tissue beneath the arms. But there were no knives, only heat, the smallest brands. The confession etched into the skin investigators found appeared to be the final iteration, not just her own sins, but those of others. She listed names. She described betrayals Ashton forced them to commit, reporting when another child cried, refused to kneel, flinched at the cold. Every sin had a corresponding mark, every mark a meaning. Micah wept during silence. Ruth sang under breath. Caleb refused to kneel. I saw, I spoke, I earned their share. What unsettled the forensics team wasn't just the detail, but the fact that the skin showed signs of healing. These weren't wounds burned at once. They were added slowly over time, layered, scar over scar, letter over letter. She had survived it all long enough to carry the full message. And then, when it was complete, it was removed, not by tearing, not by fire. The edges had been cut with surgical care, the dermis peeled back like the page of a book. One corner bore a final separate mark, a circle with a dot at the center flanked by 3 slashes. It matched symbols found in Ashton's letters. He had called it the sigil of completion. Beside it, Lydia had signed not in words but in blood. Pressed thumb, child-sized. There was no record of her body, no burial, no ashes that could be confirmed. But her skin had survived, not as evidence, as scripture, because to Ashton the body was the only holy text that could not lie. And Lydia, she had been rewritten until even her flesh confessed. They didn't find the room until late in the excavation, behind a bricked-over stairwell in what was once thought to be a shallow root cellar. The mortar was newer than the rest of the house, the bricks uneven, as if set in haste but with trembling precision. When removed, the opening revealed a narrow passageway leading down into a space untouched by rot or weather. The air was still, too still. The walls were thick with padding, not the kind used for comfort or protection, but for erasure. Thick folds of cotton sewn into the beams and then nailed into place, layer upon layer. It didn't feel like a room, it felt like the inside of something trying very hard not to be heard. Every surface bore marks, not carvings but scratches, shallow and desperate. Children's fingernails had raked across the cloth again and again, tearing small holes into the fabric only to find more layers beneath. No furniture, no candles, just a single shelf carved into the stone wall, and on it, 5 jars. Each sealed with wax, each cloudy with brine. Floating inside each one, pale, slender, coiled like tiny slugs, were human vocal cords. Cleanly removed, preserved in formaldehyde, the labels beneath them were handwritten, etched onto strips of leather sewn to the jars. Miriam, Thomas, Caleb, Ruth, Eliza. No last names, but none were needed. These names matched the ones from Ashton's ledgers, all children marked as quieted before the final entries ended. The cords showed signs of careful extraction. No damage to surrounding muscle, no tearing. Whoever removed them had anatomical knowledge and time. Later analysis confirmed the tissue had been brined shortly after death, but not immediately. There had been a gap, as if someone had waited. The floor of the room was stone worn smooth in a strange pattern. An oval groove traced into the center like something heavy had been dragged in a circle again and again. And along the ceiling, investigators found hooks, dozens small and evenly spaced. They weren't strong enough to hang weight, not even a child's. But they had held something, fabric perhaps, or wire, a web of control. Something meant to divide the space into boundaries. In a torn page recovered from Ashton's journal, there's mention of the vestibule of obedience, a place where the voice is punished. But not the child. He describes it as the unlearning room, a chamber where children are left with their own noise until even that betrays them. The soul will resist with sound, he writes. But once the echo dies, the soul can be guided. Further in the journal, he describes a process called echo draining. The child was instructed to speak a phrase aloud, always the same one. I am ready to be emptied. If the voice trembled, the child was made to kneel on salt. If it cracked, the phrase was repeated, louder, then softer, then whispered, until there was nothing left. Some children went mute without force, others required correction. That, Ashton believed, was mercy. There were no windows, no light source, only the padded walls, the empty space, the jars. This room wasn't made for isolation. It was made for extraction, not of the body but of will. The children who entered were not meant to emerge the same. Some didn't emerge at all. And those who did, their voices did not follow. The study was sealed behind a false wall, one so perfectly aligned with the paneling that only a change in airflow betrayed its existence. When investigators finally pried it open, they found a chamber untouched by time, yet obsessed with it. At its center stood a grandfather clock, tall and narrow but inverted, not just in direction but in design. The pendulum swung backward, the numbers had been recarved in reverse, and the hands, still ticking slowly, moved counterclockwise. Someone had wound it recently, or it had never stopped. The clock wasn't freestanding. Its base was fused into a cast-iron basin, scorched black and layered with fine white ash. This wasn't for mechanics. This was for fire. A cremation chamber small enough to remain unnoticed, built into the pedestal like an altar. Around its edge were inscriptions in Latin and Old English, phrases roughly translated to return to the moment before breath and undo what was done in flesh. Along the shelf behind it were notes, hundreds of them, stacked in a brittle tower and weighted by a rusted metronome. The handwriting was Ashton's. He called the process chronological reversal of the impure. In his theory, every sin began at the moment of birth, when the body declared itself separate from the divine. The first breath to him was rebellion. Time was not a measure of growth, but of decay. To undo sin, he wrote, one must walk backward through the hours of the body's failure. The clock was his tool. He believed its motion marked the soul's return to its original silence. Beside the clock, in a carved wooden box lined with velvet, were 10 sets of baby teeth, full sets cleaned and arranged in strands like rosaries. Each strand had a small knot of linen tied at the end, marked with a single embroidered letter. BRML and so on. They matched the names. But it wasn't just the presence of the teeth that disturbed the forensics team. It was their order. They weren't random. They followed the sequence of normal loss, incisors, canines, molars, as if mapped out, preserved as milestones of a process reversed. Some of the teeth were scored with fine carvings almost invisible to the eye. Under magnification, tiny symbols appeared: crosses, stars, spiral patterns that matched markings found in the cellar beams. Ashton had annotated each tooth in his ledger. He described them as gateways through which the voice once passed. In one note, he wrote, "The first tooth surrendered is the first sin forgiven. The last tooth surrendered is the soul's final resistance." The ashes in the base were human but fragmented, not from a full body but partial. Scraps of burned bone, skin, perhaps hair. The concentration was small but significant. It suggested ritual, not disposal. Someone, or something, had been placed inside the clock's basin and reduced slowly. And above the flames, time had ticked backward, each second meant to erase something that had already happened. Or something that never should have. This wasn't repentance, it wasn't purification. It was correction by subtraction, a belief that sin could be unmade by reversing the body's natural order. Ashton didn't punish the children for what they did, he punished them for being born. And when time could not be reversed fast enough, he tried to burn what had marked them, their voice, their breath, their teeth, all of it undone in the shadow of a clock that never moved forward. The last intact journal from the Ashton homestead was dated in the early months of 1887. Its entries grew erratic, uneven, as though the writer's hand trembled with urgency or exhaustion. But one section was written with absolute clarity, each letter pressed hard into the page as though carved rather than inked. It was titled simply, "Reconciliation." The date given was March 4th, 1887. The entry described the night in which, according to Isaac Ashton, the echoes of his name would be released. 10 voices folded into silence at once, completing what he had worked toward for decades. The language was not sermon, but invocation. He spoke of 10 vessels, each prepared through years of correction, each carrying marks of obedience in marrow and skin. He wrote that the ritual could only be performed when the heavens closed their eye. A rare eclipse recorded that night across Massachusetts. Meteorological reports confirmed it. A sky darkened for hours, the stars erased, the air unnaturally still. Farmers in nearby towns noted their animals restless, their roosters crowing at midnight, dogs whining as if an unseen storm pressed against the horizon. For Ashton, this was not omen but opportunity. He believed the eclipse erased the separation between body and spirit, that time was unstitched and could be reordered. The journal outlines how he led the children into the garden one by one, each bound to a marker bearing their virtue: obedience, modesty, silence, cleanliness. He wrote of placing a token in each hand: a button, a tooth, a strip of muslin stitched with their name. Each token, he claimed, sealed their submission. Then, as the shadow deepened across the moon, he began what he called the folding. The children were positioned in pairs, the mirrors he had so carefully collected over the years. He described their breathing, their stillness, their resistance, their eventual collapse into quiet. He wrote not of screams, but of what he called a great inhalation, as though the earth itself had drawn them in. The journal is explicit about his intent: to end 10 lives in one breath, to silence 10 echoes in one chord, to reconcile the dissonance that plagues flesh. He believed their deaths would not be individual but collective. One act, one offering, erasing what he considered the stain of birth itself. When the eclipse reached its height, he claims the garden filled with a brilliance unseen by common eyes, though no neighbors reported light, only darkness. In his words, "The night closed its lid, the stars fell inward, and only my name remained." Every one of the 10 children's names in his ledger is marked with a final notation on that date. No more corrections, No more notes of failure or resistance. Just a cross drawn through each column, the same hand that had written for years now suddenly finished. In the county archives, death certificates exist for 10 dependents of the Ashton estate, all signed on March 5, 1887. Each lists cause of death as natural weakness. No bodies were ever recovered, no graves ever marked, only paper sealed and filed. Historians would later argue whether Ashton killed them all that night, whether they had already been long dead, or whether the eclipse was simply the moment he chose to end his record-keeping. But the fact remains: 10 names, 10 deaths, 1 date. And when investigators stood decades later in the ruined garden beneath the same sky, they found the soil unnaturally compacted, as if pressed from above by weight no plow or footstep could explain. No birds sang there, no crickets hummed, just silence, as though the stars themselves had never returned. It was the last dig before the site was to be sealed off for good. Most of the team believed they had uncovered all there was to find: the gardens layered with bone, the sealed chambers, the ash pits. But then a ground probe struck against wood in a place no one expected. Along the edge of the clearing where the soil sloped into the tree line, what they unearthed was not a coffin, not in the traditional sense. It was a narrow box no longer than 4 feet high, built not for someone to rest, but for someone to be contained. When the lid was lifted, the air that escaped was sour, thick with iron. Inside was a child, not laid down but buried upright, her body shrunken into itself, knees bent against her chest, spine pressed against the back of the box. Her jaw had been wired shut with thin loops of copper, the kind used in surgical stitching, forcing the teeth together until the bone cracked under pressure. And on her eyes, 2 small coins, tarnished black, pressed so firmly against the sockets that the bone beneath them had flattened with time. The boards of the coffin interior were scored with words, carved from the inside outward with what must have been fingernails or a shard of bone. Most of the scratches were illegible, but one word repeated again and again until the grain splintered: cold. When the team pried the box away from its resting place, they found something even more disturbing. Directly behind the skull, carved into the outer plank, were 2 words etched from the outside in. She talked. The letters were large, deliberate, carved as though meant to be read by anyone who uncovered her. It was less a note than a judgment. Her body bore no signs of natural burial preparation, no shroud, no shoes, no ritual of care. Instead, the copper wiring seemed almost ceremonial, as if silence had been demanded beyond death itself. Her hands were bound at the wrists not with rope, but with strips of muslin stitched crudely and fastened with wax. Analysis showed the muslin bore faint traces of ink, fragments of scripture verses written over and over, then torn and repurposed to bind. It was as if the word of God had been made into shackles. Forensic dating suggested she was between 8 and 10 years old. The smallness of her bones, the uneven growth of her teeth, all pointed to malnutrition and stress. What haunted the examiners most was the unfinished state of her paperwork. A certificate was found in the Ashton records bearing her name, Miriam Ashton, but the document was incomplete. Cause of death blank, signature absent. It was as if even the bureaucracy could not close her life, as if her silence had not been fully secured on paper. In Ashton's journal fragments, one entry stands out in chilling proximity to her burial. He writes of one lamb too willing to speak, a child who resisted stillness with sound even in fasting. He claimed the voice tempted the others, that every whispered word was rot spread among roots. He described how the mouth must be stopped, not with prayer, but with earth. The timing, the language, the missing certificate, all point to Miriam. The grave itself left an impression on the soil different from the others. The box was narrower, intentionally confining, forcing the body into a posture of shame. She was not placed to rest. She was placed to stand, forever trapped between the living and the dead, marked for the crime of voice. And the coins on her eyes, they were not payment for passage. They were punishment, weight to hold shut even the possibility of sight. When the grave was finally documented, the investigators covered her again. There was no ceremony, no prayer spoken aloud. Only a marker set at the edge of the clearing, unmarked by name, its wood blank. For how could they carve truth into it without repeating what Ashton had already written? She talked, and for that, she was buried standing. By the time the full scale of the Ashton discoveries reached state officials, nearly a decade had passed since the night marked as reconciliation. The ruins had long been swallowed by moss and vines, the clearing avoided even by hunters, and yet the evidence laid out by investigators was damning enough to demand a legal proceeding. Crates of artifacts were delivered to the courthouse. Ledgers scrawled in Isaac Ashton's hand, preserved skin marked with confessions, the jars of vocal cords, and the upright grave of Miriam Ashton. The state prepared charges of unlawful confinement, abuse, medical malpractice, and homicide. The case file was thick enough to topple on a desk. Yet when it came time to assign guilt, the machinery of justice stuttered. There was no one left to prosecute. Isaac Ashton had vanished. No death record, no grave. Some whispered he had burned himself in the furnace with the children. His ashes mingled with theirs. Others believed he had fled, shielded by sympathizers, disappearing into one of the monastic communities he had once studied among. The law required a defendant, and without a body or a signed death certificate, his name was left suspended in limbo. The estate itself could be charged in civil court, but estates do not answer questions, do not confess, do not hang. The only living Ashtons were women, cousins, widows, and 2 daughters of Isaac's estranged brother. They were summoned, questioned, examined like exhibits. But every witness was deemed unreliable. Eunice Catherwood, mutilated and incoherent, had died weeks after her discovery. The others either claimed no knowledge or recited half-mad fragments of prayers, their minds broken by years in silence or service. One wept continuously through her testimony, repeating the same phrase, "I kept the salt clean." Another refused to sit, insisting chairs were traps, standing rigid until the judge excused her. Experts labeled them unfit. Their words were struck from the record. The courtroom itself grew uneasy with the case. Reporters who attended the preliminary hearings described the air as sour, as though something had followed the evidence crates in. Jurors excused themselves with illness. A clerk tasked with transcribing Ashton's journals fainted, later saying she felt the words were whispered at her as she wrote them down. Even the judge, a man known for severity, remarked that he had never presided over a matter so stained. In the end, the trial never reached opening arguments. The Attorney General announced that without a living defendant, the state could not proceed. The judge issued a ruling that all files, artifacts, and testimonies would be sealed for the protection of the public. The phrase carried a chilling ambiguity. Protection from what? From the evidence itself? From the family's influence? Or from the knowledge of what had been allowed to happen in plain daylight under the veneer of piety? The crates were sent to the archives, catalogued under restricted access. The ledgers were boxed and locked. The jars were buried in state storage vaults beneath iron lids. And the graves at the Ashton property were filled again, covered without ceremony, marked only with surveyor stakes that rotted within a year. It was as though the state had agreed to bury not just the children, but the memory of them. For decades afterward, whispers lingered. Lawyers who had touched the case refused to discuss it. Clerks who filed the papers swore they dreamed of bells ringing at night, long after the files were sealed. And in Manchester County, people knew only what they had always known, that the Ashton place was best left forgotten. Justice had asked its questions, but with no one alive to answer, silence became the verdict. The trial never began. The truth was folded into the same silence that had consumed the children. In early 1896, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts quietly enacted House Bill 4401, an unassuming piece of legislation that received little attention from the public but sent ripples through orphanages, adoption bureaus, and religious institutions across the state. Its core stipulations were threefold: that all adoptions, public or private, must include photographic identification of the child, that no religious entity could house more than 4 unrelated minors without state oversight, and that all children under custody must be physically seen and documented by a certified official once per quarter. On paper, it read like a procedural update. In truth, it was a reckoning. The bill's origins were never publicly debated. There was no press conference, no headline. But in the margins of internal memos passed between state legislators, one phrase appeared again and again: the 10 Virtues case. It wasn't a formal name. It didn't need to be. Everyone close to the matter knew what it meant. It referred not to a lawsuit, but to a horror. The untried, unpunished legacy of Isaac Ashton, though Ashton's name never appeared in the law's language. When the structure of the bill mirrored the gaps his compound had exploited. Photographic identification was introduced specifically to prevent the erasure of children after placement. Ashton had taken in at least 10 minors across 2 decades, none of whom were ever photographed, registered at school, or medically examined once removed from the orphanages. They became names in ledgers, voices in jars, teeth in velvet boxes. The second clause, limiting religious compounds from housing multiple unrelated minors, was aimed directly at institutions like Ashton's estate, which had operated under the pretense of spiritual reformation, shielded from inspection by ecclesiastical privilege. The law stripped that protection. Monasteries, seminaries, and rural houses of moral instruction were no longer permitted to isolate children under the veil of faith. The third clause, mandatory quarterly inspection, was perhaps the most radical. It required state eyes on every child, at regular intervals under penalty of removal. It was, in effect, a legislative promise. No more forgetting. No more silence mistaken for sanctity. Privately, some lawmakers balked at the cost, but a few key voices pushed the bill through, most notably a junior clerk named Henry Leavitt, who had personally transcribed Ashton's surviving journals. Leavitt never gave interviews. He disappeared from public service 2 years later. But in a letter to his sister, found posthumously in a private collection, he wrote, "I have seen what absence looks like on paper. It is not blank. It is full of names someone meant to erase." Though the law never acknowledged its true inspiration, its timing was no accident. The bill passed less than a year after the final excavation at the Ashton property. Archivists believe it was rushed into place before public outcry could ignite, a preventative measure against scandal rather than a response to it. But in the counties closest to the Ashton ruins, families noticed. Adoption agencies shuttered overnight, private orphanages relocated or closed, church-run homes quietly removed language about moral refinement from their charters. Something had shifted, not loudly, but permanently. No memorial was ever built for the 10 lost children, no charges filed, but the law stood. And in that law was the shadow of their names, never spoken, never carved in stone, but encoded in regulation. An attempt, however late, to stop it from happening again.